Native American mythology speaks of a group of tiny humans who would terrorize other tribes, killing them with little poisoned arrows and kidnapping their children in the middle of the night. All of this was considered mere legend. Then Cecil Maine found this proof of that legend. It's proof, right? Well, either way, unless you want to be terrorized by the legendary Namiragar tribe tonight, I suggest you like this video right now. Also, turn that bell notification on so you don't miss my weekly Moonlit tales. The Namiragar will terrorize you, no joke. Now let's get into it. Long before Wyoming was a state, the Shoshone Native Americans spoke of a strange pygmy tribe called the Namiragar. The name designates that these weren't just small people, but they were also cannibals. And they were tiny, adults standing no more than 2 feet tall, and they were brutal even amongst themselves, so much so that if any among them were injured or incapable of contributing to the group, they would sneak up behind them and smash their skulls in, killing members of their own tribe. It was unwise to cross the Namiragar. Not only did they have tiny poison arrows, they also apparently could turn invisible and had super speed and menacing razor-sharp teeth. And they would regularly raid Paiute and Shoshone camps, attacking them in the middle of the night and kidnap their children. The Shoshone and the Namiragar warred with each other for untold years before they eventually learned to respect each other's borders, and a relative peace ensued. And the Namiragar Pygmy Tribe, as years went by, slowly faded from history and into mythology. But even in relatively modern times, people have claimed to see these little people. Lewis and Clark even wrote in their journals about how, while staying with the Sioux Nation, they ventured toward the Little People Mound. Meriwether reported that the Little People were devils about 18 inches tall, and how the natives were terrorized by them. Around 1860, Crow Chief Plenty Coops, at 9 years old, had an encounter with the chief of the Little People, who guided him through a journey into the spirit world and back. But it seems like we always end up having to take someone else's word for it, that these little people are real. What would be helpful is if we could find some sort of physical evidence, right? Well, actually, we may have done just that. When I research a story, I try to share with you a detailed timeline of events, but the events of this story are really confusing with a lot of conflicting information. That being said, sometime around 1932, Cecil Maine and Frank Carr, 2 prospectors, were following a seam of gold through the mountains, hoping to strike it rich. And they came to a rock face and started blasting somewhere in those mountains. Right there. Specifically, the Pedro Range in Wyoming, near the Pathfinder Reservoir about 60 miles south of Casper. They blew the rock face to smithereens, hoping to hit the jackpot, and they did. But it wasn't a pot of gold they found. They happened upon an opening in the rock face. A small cave opened up. It was about 4 feet wide and 4 feet tall, and after the debris had cleared, Cecil Maine shimmied his way into the opening to explore the inside. About 15 feet in, he shone his light forward, and his utter astonishment, he saw staring him in the face and sitting upright and cross-legged with arms folded reverently, a small person. A 6-inch tall person, 16 inches if you were to stand it upright, naturally mummified by the Wyoming climate. The mummy had a flat nose and a low forehead with bulging eyes and a sardonic smile across its face. It even had its nose intact, Neil deGrasse Tyson. But most strange of all was the top of its skull appeared to be missing. I can only imagine what seeing that for the first time must have been like. Cecil reported that chills shot through his body, and after the initial shock of seeing the figure wore off, he carefully picked it up and noted that it only weighed a little over a pound. I get chills just thinking about it. Cecil and Carr took it immediately to Casper to show the townsfolk their once-in-a-lifetime incredible find. But to their dismay, the townspeople didn't believe them. Surely this was a stitched-together, fabricated hoax. Images of sideshow attractions of half men, half fish were conjured, and most dismissed their claim that this was a genuine find outright. And then Carr unexpectedly passed away shortly after the discovery, leaving the figure figure entirely to Cecil Maine. Carr's death was later attributed to the curse of the mummy. In fact, the ensuing years ushered in a very niche viral moment, shall we say, for this mummy, because it quickly gained national renown, but no one really knew what to think of it, which led to a lot of wild speculation, including this article, which flat out sprinted with the ancient pygmy race of North America theory, claiming the mummy was an adult, it had razor-sharp teeth, ate meat, and had its head smashed in from a race of soulless little people when America was merely a sideshow a million years ago, and the mummy was cursed too. But was this poor little mummy destined to be nothing more than a sideshow attraction? Cecil would go on to try to monetize his find. He knew it wasn't a hoax. He found it in a sealed off cave, for goodness sakes, but despite his attempts, he simply wasn't successful at capitalizing on Pedro. The name the mummy quickly took on as it was discovered in the Pedro Mountains. But people simply didn't believe Pedro was real, although some who looked at it couldn't help but think of the Native American legend about the race of pygmies, the Namirigar. But the people inclined to see Pedro in that light were also the people who were more afraid of it than they were interested in paying money to see it. Maybe they thought it was real, but they didn't want anything to do with it because they saw it as more of a bad omen than anything else, pointing to the untimely death of Carr as an example to stay away from it at all costs. Cecil, low-key, became the talk of the nation, and not really in a good way. He often heard people snickering behind his back, and he wasn't a savvy businessman. He didn't know what to do with Pedro, and so frustrated that this amazing find was causing him more trouble than reward, he decided to wash his hands of it. He sold it for a flat rate of $25 to an interested party, Mr. Homer Sherrill of Crawford, Nebraska. Sherrill had a little bit more success with Pedro. He set up a tent, charged people 25 cents per viewing, and he did this supposedly on and off for something like 7 years. And in that time, a certain 10-year-old boy, Eugene Basher, I didn't write this, convinced his dad to give him 25 cents to see Pedro. He marched into the tent, and it changed the course of his life. Huh. Okay. Whatever. Well, anyway, Homer Sherrill, by all reports, seemed to have, at some point, sold it to Floyd Jones, who displayed Pedro in his drugstore in Meateats, where then, once again, a certain Ivan Goodman saw it and bought it for $3,000 to put on display in his car dealership in Casper. Goodman, unlike Cecil, was a businessman, and to help drive traffic to his car dealership, he took out ads featuring Pedro, who now proudly sat displayed on a wooden base with a glass dome, out for all who came to his car dealership to see. This happened around 1940. One ad he put out said, "It's educational, it's scientific, it will amaze and thrill you. It's a pygmy preserved as it actually lived, and this pygmy was 65 years old when it died." Pedro was 65 years old when he died? This is the crux of the whole story. You see, the current narrative today that hasn't changed since Robert Stack, I love you, reported on the story in 1994 on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, is that there was no real scientific study of Pedro done until 1950. And it's true that around 1950, Goodman took Pedro to Dr. Harry Shapiro, curator of biological anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And supposedly, he confirmed to Goodman's dismay that Pedro was an infant child, not an adult, who had died of anencephaly, a rare condition in which the baby is born without a brain and parts of its skull. But if that's what the scientific conclusion was, and then again only in 1950, then where did Goodman get the moxie, shall we say, to claim that Pedro was a 65-year-old mummified man prior to the first scientific study done of Pedro? Was he just a businessman leaning hard into the legendary race of pygmies myth that was saturating the sensationalized news? Well, maybe. But he didn't just pull this information out of thin air, and neither did the newspapers. You see, the current narrative today concerning Pedro's first scientific debut and what was said about him is really wrong. WyomingHistory.org, along with multiple other sources, say that around 1950, Goodman took the mummy to Dr. Harry Shapiro. Shapiro examined it, took x-rays, and sent the films around that time to George Gill, then professor of biological anthropology at the University of Wyoming. Gill has confirmed that he received those x-rays and that he and Shapiro agreed that the mummy was almost certainly a human baby, either stillborn or dead shortly after birth. The child probably died of anencephaly, the congenital absence of a large part of the brain. So there you have it. It seems that WyomingHistory.org has solved the mystery. Pedro isn't a man from a legendary Pygmy tribe. You've got multiple scientists, professors, and doctors in their fields confirming one with another that Pedro is a child with a rare and unfortunate birth defect. And that very well may be the case. Wait. What? Oopsie. What? Oh no. Oh no, no. I gave you the shorts. You can say whatever you want in those, but this is my story. Mr. Rational Pants over there had something to attend to. I'll finish up here. And that very well may have been the case, that Pedro was a child. But what's this? Oopsies, Wyoming history. Looks like Gill didn't get his PhD until 71? Is that 21 years after Shapiro sent the x-rays of the most significant find of the century to little Georgie, professor of his little elementary class, maybe? Yeah, George Gill was about 10 years old when Shapiro made his first x-rays of Pedro. And make no mistake about this, Wyoming history isn't the only place where this misinformation is coming from. Just about every article, blogspot, Instagram, and TikTok I can find about this gets this story wrong. And let's see, oopsies again, what did Shapiro actually say about Pedro? Well, the only sources I can find states that Shapiro examined the mummy for a whole month. And after a whole month looking at Pedro, his conclusion was, I can only say that if this little thing is an adult, it would be the first evidence of a race of little men on this continent I have ever seen. And he went on to say that he could not estimate the age of the mummy. And he says nothing about anencephaly. And as far as I can tell, you don't have anything that actually says Shapiro said it was anencephaly, except for, oh wait, what's this I see? I see here a personal correspondence used as a source with Dr. George Gill himself, the very person who you're claiming received the x-rays from Shapiro when he was in elementary school. 1950 was not the first time Pedro was scientifically evaluated either. As early as July 1934, just a couple years after Cecil pulled Pedro out of the mountain, the Crawford Tribune was reporting on this mountain mummy, and they say that Homer Sherrill, the person who originally purchased Pedro from Cecil, did more than spid Pedro as a sideshow attraction for 7 years before Goodman got a hold of him. In fact, like Goodman, Sherrill tried to figure out what Pedro was. He sent the mummy to Dr. Ellie Parkins of Harvard University, where Pedro was actually first x-rayed. And this was in 1934, more than 15 years prior to Dr. Shapiro and the elementary student George Gill first evaluating it. And this is significant because these wild publications about an ancient race of pygmies and Goodman's claims that Pedro was an adult weren't as unfounded as the modern narrative would like to say. Maybe it was still a little unfounded, but they drew from what the original scientists had to say about it. Dr. Parkins, along with the curator of the anthropological department and his 2 assistants and the curator of the Egyptian department of the Boston Museum, said that Pedro had silver gray hair, implying that he could have been an adult. And that Pedro, from, yes, X-rays, the first X-rays of Pedro in 1934, showed a full set of razor-sharp teeth, and that marks on his body indicated that death might have resulted from wounds. And in case you're wondering, even in 1934, the scientific community was aware of the condition of anencephaly, but these doctors didn't originally point to that. So Pedro had already been thoroughly examined by the time Goodman had him on display in his car dealership in the 1940s. But you won't see that anywhere unless you're insane like me and find yourself sifting through hours worth of newspaper.com articles, and I don't think it should be that hard to find that information. And you might be wondering, wouldn't a full set of teeth prove Pedro was an adult? And wouldn't that be easy to identify on x-rays? Well, I didn't know this until my source, shout out, you know who you are, told me that babies are born with 2 already developed sets of teeth that just grow in later. And do you remember that line I snuck in earlier in the script about Eugene Basher's life-changing moment? Well, it changed his life because he became fascinated by Pedro and went on to study him and other mummies in great detail. And he had this to say about Pedro's teeth.
It also has a full set of teeth, quite prominent teeth. And infants would show 2 sets of undeveloped teeth still up in the jaws. These have descended and there's no other teeth above them, like a baby or a young person would have.
Who's to say that 10-year-old Eugene is a trustworthy source in this matter? Well, I don't know. He might actually be a better source than 10-year-old Georgie Gill, who's masquerading as a professor emeritus of anthropology 20 years before he even got his PhD. And I'm not even saying he's purposely being deceptive. But how are you going to have a personal email correspondence with Wyoming history and let them think you're a contemporary to Dr. Shapiro in 1950? And somehow I think Shapiro at some point got mixed up with Dr. Paul Martin, who apparently was the one who actually stated that Pedro had anencephaly originally, not Shapiro. And the only source I can find for even him saying that is a 3-second shot of a document on the 1994 episode of Unsolved Mysteries where Stack is stating that Martin is saying that Pedro had anencephaly, and as far as I know, that could be a fabricated document shown for dramatic effect, like 90% of the video in Unsolved Mysteries, and that the document never existed in the first place, because they might possibly getting their narrative entirely from who? George Gill.
Dr. George Gill still disagrees.
Yeah, all the physicians and physical anthropologists that I know of who I've ever looked at that I've been able to verify to actually...
But maybe it did exist. Email me the sources, because I can't find them. Email me the sources and I'll shut up about this and make an apology video. I just want to know what the truth is. This is why the Moonlit Coast can't have nice things. All right. Come on back. In Goodman's attempt to find more out about Pedro, after the whole Shapiro fiasco, he loaned Pedro to Dr. Leonard Wadler for research purposes, but Goodman would die of a stroke shortly thereafter, and Pedro was never returned to Goodman's family. There were reports that Wadler kept him giving private showings of Pedro to interested parties as late as 1975 at his home. Wadler died in 1980, and no one has seen Pedro since. His family denies any knowledge of the mummy. But this might be a strategic denial, because regardless of whether Pedro is an old man or child, he would almost certainly be subject to the Native American Graves and Reparations Act of 1990. It would most certainly be requested to be returned to its rightful native home if Pedro were ever to show up again. For decades, Pedro was unique, but in 1990, George Gill, at this time actually professor of anthropology in Wyoming, was contacted by a Native American family. They had in their possession another tiny mummified person. It had been passed down in their family for generations, and they kept it in their attic. This was a little girl named Chiquita. She was mummified just like Pedro, measuring only inches in height, and she was found in the same area. Gil examined her and determined she was 500 years old, and that she in fact did die of anencephaly, and that she was Native American despite having blonde hair. Scientists have desperately wanted to compare Chiquita with Pedro, but as of filming this, November 2023, Pedro is nowhere to be found. Despite the controversy, I have to admit that it looks like Pedro really might have had anencephaly and was a child, not an adult member of an ancient Pygmy tribe. But in fairness to the controversy, why don't you come back and close this out? I know you've got one more thing to say, but just one more thing. I'll close by saying that the curator of the Egyptian department of the Boston Museum, who has had extensive experience in digging and finding mummies in Egypt, said in the original 1934 examination of Pedro, he said, quote, "The preservation of this Aboriginal Indian mummy has the appearance of preservation similar to that of Egyptian specimens." And we all know the Smithsonian actively suppresses any genuine Hebraic and Egyptian artifacts that make their way inconveniently into the history of North America, and they exist! They do! Okay, they do! Alright. Okay, that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. See you next time. And like and subscribe.